So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Shara. I really, really like to be with you in person, but whether we want it or not, we are living in times of massive change. And even before the pandemic, we were going through a period of massive shift to our society because of a combination of things, including climate change, rapid advances in technology, major advances to be human, but the pandemic has put a major snare into the works that is causing us all kinds of grief and is literally changing our lives on a daily basis. And I'll spend a few minutes on that. Really, where I want to talk today is about the technologies that are going to be most important in the future and these are going to spin off to both impact your company and also provide brand new investment areas that many of you in the room should consider, if not from a company basis, perhaps from a personal basis, or to advise your clients. So let's start what's happening with the pandemic. We're on what many people are calling a corona coaster. And unfortunately, I wish I could say it's going to be over next year, but this virus is proving to be extremely tricky. It's actually something that I've talked about for quite some time, that we should be expecting lots of twists and turns way that this virus will mutate, and I really wish I had been wrong with those predictions, but what we're seeing right now are all kinds of new mutations and variants, and when it comes to something like the new normal, that many of you may have heard about, I would say we're not going to be seeing the new normal for quite some time. Some people are optimistic and are forecasting, well, maybe 2 to 3 years. Others are saying it may go out all the way to the end of the decade. The way things are panning out, it's really, really hard for me to say exactly when we're going to see the end of this. But what we're going through now literally is a reset of our day and the way that we live and the way that we work. In fact, I was meant to be going to Sydney next week. I'm actually in the Gold Coast. I moved from Sydney to the Gold Coast luckily 2 weeks ago before the border slammed shut. And the major event that I was meant to be speaking at was postponed rather at the last minute. And many of you would have been going through the same thing. In normal times, I would have loved to have flown up to Hong Kong to be with you in person, but because of this pandemic, of course, I'm in the Gold Coast and Ben is in Sydney, and we're not with you live in person as we might be in normal times. And we need to think for what this is going to mean for our businesses and for us as people. So one of the things that is absolutely for sure is that remote working is here to stay. And get used to video conferencing, get used to people in your organization needing to switch from being able to come to an office and gather in person to needing to be isolated and working from home. And when it comes to working from home, there are a couple of key things that we would really want to consider, and I think Ben will really relate to this. And one is security. Many people, especially in the beginning days of the pandemic, were using their own laptop, different kinds of IT systems they might have had in their house on a personal basis. But the kind of IT security that you find in a typical home is a lot different than the type of IT security that you would find in an office. And it is absolutely imperative, really imperative, that if your people are going to work from home, that they be using company computers that have been configured correctly with antivirus software, with firewalls, that everything has been checked out. There's also the ergonomics. Working from a small laptop screen is not the same as working from a big 34-inch monitor, which I happen to work from in my office. You are more productive when you have more screen real estate, and it's just not the same. You also need to consider safety and ergonomics of your staff, because you need to have comfortable desks and comfortable chairs. So as the pandemic starts to ebb and flow, I think what we're going to see is a combination of people working from home some of the time and maybe working from the office part of the time, depending on what part of the world that you're in and also what's happening at any given point in time. But one of the things that I'm already seeing, and I spoke to a global real estate association about this, is that around the world, corporations are starting to downsize the real estate holdings that they have for office space as their contracts start to come up for renewal. And that's going to have a full-on opportunity. And I know that some of you in the room are in the real estate business, and that will probably impact you. It's also going to impact all of the businesses that surround these big corporate headquarters that literally thrive on employees, coming and going. So there are going to be a whole lot of ripple effects with this pandemic and working from home. Now, I said I'd talk about technologies where I want to focus my talk. Artificial intelligence is one of these technologies that is going to impact literally every single industry in the world, bar none. And when I talk about AI, I'm talking about it as a really big umbrella term. So I'm talking about techniques like machine learning and deep learning, but I'm also talking about natural language and voice recognition. I'm talking about facial recognition and image recognition and emotion detection, whether it's from your voice or the expressions on your face. I'm talking about chatbots. I'm talking about gesture control. I'm talking about virtual digital assistants, smart robots, driverless cars, and a whole lot more. And AI uses big data sets to start to learn using techniques, primarily deep learning, but also to a lesser extent machine learning. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is advances in quantum computing. And I'm not going to go really deep into quantum physics, or I'd probably bore you all to death. But if you take the advances in quantum computing, which are happening in research labs and commercial labs around the world, you're looking at potentially double exponential growth rate. So double what Moore's law was. And if you combine that with AI getting smarter and smarter and smarter, you can start to see this conjunction of what might happen when you combine AI running on super fast computing platforms. Now, robots, as I had mentioned, are part of this whole AI equation. This is a picture from a company called Kindred AI, and they make robots that literally work in warehouses. And what's interesting about this company is that their philosophy is that the best way to teach AI is to actually instantiate it into and have it trained by humans through something called imitation learning. So the way that this robot gets trained is that you have a human in a virtual reality environment using telepresence to literally control the robot arms and teach it the difference between picking up, say, that piece of cloth that you see in the picture and a delicate vase. And you can apply this to almost any industry. This is a new growth area, and there's a similar corollary for teaching software-based AI, and that's called reinforcement learning, where you literally put hooks in. Humans can start to teach the AI what's right, what's wrong, what needs to be fixed. Another interesting development along the same lines is an innovation from a company called Sarcos Robotics, and they have come up with a number of different robot exoskeletons. This is their first one, called Guardian XM, and it literally is designed to help people with occupational and safety hazards. So this exoskeleton takes the weight off of the person, including the exoskeleton, and literally lifting up 100 pounds feels like you're lifting 5 pounds, just a couple of kilograms. They have a couple of other models. They've got one that is teleoperated, and that's really interesting. So it's on a mobile base, it has arms, but you can have someone sitting at home anywhere in the world, literally controlling these devices. And they've just come out with yet another new one that's able to lift up to 1,000 pounds, which is about 454 kilograms. So this is going to be really important in terms of how do we navigate in this world of viruses and potential contagions and keep our people safe. The other really interesting thing about the way that this particular company is deploying its business model is that they're not actually trying to sell the robots, they're offering it on an as-a-service basis. That's something in the software industry that we've been used to for a long time, and for at least 6 years, I've been predicting that robots as a service is going to be a really big investment area. And for those of you who are in banking who want to invest in new fleets of things, investing in fleets of robots that you then lease out is not a whole lot different than investing in, say, a rental car fleet. Now, when it comes to AI and any technology, frankly, there's always good and bad. So image recognition is great. However, it's really easy to trick an AI into thinking that an image that looks to you as a human, like a bus, into thinking that it's actually an ostrich. And all you have to do is somehow get in there, whether it's through hacking or on purpose, and jiggle less than 1% of the pixels in an image, and an AI will think an image that looks to you as a human, as a doggy, it will look like a bus. Now, there are some pretty serious ramifications to, and I have to say, it's not the flaw in AI, it's the underlying mathematics that have to do with linear functions. Again, I won't go deep into the details of that, but it's something you need to be aware of if you're deploying image recognition, that it's not foolproof and it can be, like anything else, be hacked into or tricked. Now, facial recognition is an aspect of image recognition, but looking at our faces. And I've used an example from NEC just to show you something from real world, but this discussion is not limited to NEC capabilities. I just wanted to use a real world example. What happens with facial recognition is that the bigger face gets, the more likely it is that you might have a misidentification of a person, because we humans, there's over 7 billion of us on the planet, and there are a limited number of facial types. And it depends on how the database is trained as to whether a mistake can be made. It also depends on the quality of images you're affected to it. So if you feed in government IDs like passports or driver's licenses or so on, the database itself is likely to be robust. If you take picture or media and feed it in, then you're likely to get false positives and wrong things. But even if you have a really good database, you still can have this facial recognition technology make really bad mistakes. So 2 quick examples. One out of the UK done a couple of years ago by Civil Liberties Group, where they did a sampling of people that were identified as criminals and turned out not to be. And in fact, one of the mistakes that was made, and it's a really bizarre one, was somehow the image recognition system misidentified a young lady with long hair, about 20 years old, with a balding old man. Now that's a pretty big mistake. That was found by ACLU in the United States, was they fed in images of all the members of Congress and matched against people with criminal records, and it misidentified 35 lawmakers as actually being criminals. Now, we can joke about politicians and, honesty and so on, but there's a big difference between making a joke about politicians and actually having a misidentification of someone with a criminal record. The next thing that we have to worry about is something called defect. So let me just ask you, how many of you have heard of defects? Just raise your hands. A few of you, okay. Looks like most of you. You're from where I'm at. So basically a deepfake is where you have a video and you superimpose the image and the voice of someone else on an actor's video or hacker's video, and it looks and sounds like someone that it's not. There have been a lot of deepfake videos put up just as jokes, but where I see the next hacking vector is what if someone hacks into a video conference system, maybe the one that we're using or one that you're using in your office, and you think you're talking to your CEO or chief financial officer. It looks like him or her, it sounds like him or her, and you're discussing an upcoming merger and acquisition. You're a publicly listed company, and you're not actually talking to the person you think you're talking to, but you've disclosed very sensitive information. That has not happened yet, but it's something that I think in the next couple of years is likely to happen. And who will be responsible? Will it be the person who's accidentally disclosed the information because they were tricked? Will it be the video conferencing platform or software company? Will it be the cyber criminal? Will it be someone else? Legislation has not caught up with. We're going to get a whole new category of people called reality confirmers, and there are ways that are already being looked at to try to detect these deep fakes, such as pattern recognition and knowing real gestures of people and the way that they move and so on, that might be able to stop this in its tracks. But it's something that you need to be aware of as a potential pending threat. Speaking of threats, my gosh, what a year, what a couple of years, what a decade of cyber activity. About a year ago, we had the SolarWinds incident, which was state-based, and it impacted the United States and many other countries. Lately, the trend is ransomware. How many of you have heard about the Colonial Pipeline incident in the US? Just raise your hands. In that one, this is a company that basically puts petroleum through gas pipelines going all up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States, and they were hit with a ransomware attack, and they decided to shut the flow of gasoline, petrol, going all the way up and down. It had a major ramification. It turns out that the ransomware didn't actually impact the pipeline, it impacted the billing system, and because the company couldn't bill customers, they decided to off the flow. And this is where I think government has a role to play. If something like this happens, then I think government should have stepped in and said, hang on, the impact to our nation is so great by turning off the flow. Until we get this sorted, we'll help offset the bills and just keep the petrol flowing so that we can keep our economy flowing. Another major one was here in Australia, and it impacted globally. It was untold. There were two separate ransomware attacks, one in January last year and another in May. They were unrelated. It's getting to be worse and worse and worse, and all of you need to be aware that this is happening. So now going back to some cool positives, let's talk about Hyperloops. Hyperloops are the next generation of ultra-fast trains. Again, I'll ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have heard of Hyperloops? Okay, a few of you. So I'll just describe it. If you can see this pipe that's along the track there, this is actually in the Nevada desert. This is one of the companies that is constructing Hyperloops. It's Virgin Hyperloop. It's a test track. So what you do with a Hyperloop is literally you suck the air out of these huge tubes so that it's not being in outer space. And then you can hurl right through it because there's basically a vacuum. Pods that are filled people or cargo at very fast speeds. At average cruising speed is estimated to be at about 730 kilometers an hour. Top speed estimated to be between 1,200 and 1,300 kilometers per hour. Late last year, Virgin did a live test with its CTO, I think it was CTO and Chief Customer Experience Officer in that test pod that you see in the bottom left. And it did it on this test track. There are other companies such as HCT, Hyper Transport Technologies, the Boring Company, which is part of SpaceX, that are looking at this, and others as well. This is going to be a game changer for getting people really fast across vast distances that don't involve airlines. And in Hong Kong, you're a tightly knit city, but if you think about the wider area of China and Hong Kong, it could allow you to have people working in your CBD offices in Hong Kong that work out in the provinces in China if a Hyperloop system were to be put in your area. So going further out into the future, one of the things that we can expect to see somewhere in 2040, 2050 are self-repairing cities. And the way that these cities will repair themselves will be through itty-bitty tiny robots that literally start to detect flaws in the city before they become problematic. And I've been tracking a project that started at the University of Leeds in the UK in about 2014. I spoke to some of the chief scientists there in 2015 in a formal interview, and have been tracking the project. And they've got a whole bunch of these little mini robots right now that are looking at things like perceiving and patch holes on the ground before they turn into major potholes. Eventually, what they want to do is to have these little tiny robots act like the white blood cells in the human body and go out, including going underground into places that humans can't possibly get to, and fix things right at the first sign that maintenance is being required. Now, some of you may think, oh, that's ambitious, it's science fiction, it's never going to happen. Well, as I said, I've just moved up from Sydney, and for over 8 years now, there's been a collaboration between the University of Technology Sydney and New South Wales Roads and Maritime, which is a government organization that controls the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And they designed a robot that is based on like an inchworm that is literally able to autonomously, that is without human control, crawl through the intricate steel bridge work on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, feed pictures back to the bridge engineers, and then let them decide when grid blasting needs to be done. And that's been happening for over 8 years now. There are 2 working robots on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and they're called Sandy and Rosie. So it's not science fiction. This is science fact that's going to be science tomorrow, and another area of investment. Now, speaking of investments, and for tomorrow, sustainability and green energy is going to be increasingly important. I think everyone in the room can relate to the fact that we have had some very, very strange weather patterns over the last number of years. And we're starting to come up with a range of different renewable energies. You know about solar power. You may even have heard about some of the floating solar panels that actually float on water and are more efficient than the kind of solar panels that you put on a house or a building. You have wind farms, we even have bioluminescence, you have green hydrogen. We're using these renewable energies to take hydrogen, to split out oxygen and hydrogen from H2O from water. But there's another really exciting technology that I'd like to share with you that you may or may not have heard of. It's called blue energy. How many of you have heard of blue energy? Raise your hands. Okay, so this is new. What happens with blue energy is really interesting because it works every single day of the year, and it produces absolutely no waste that's environmentally harmful. Whenever you have a large body of fresh water meeting a large body of salt water, like an ocean, the two that mix together produce kinetic energy that can be harvested. There are a range of different techniques. I won't go into the chemical details, but essentially, if you capture them with nanoporous membranes, you can build them in conjunction with hydroelectric plants, or you can start to store the energy in batteries. And suddenly, you have this 24/7 huge source of energy that is available with the right plants being built virtually all around the world in any country that is next to an ocean. And I did a quick look at Hong Kong. I don't think you've got any areas where you've got freshwater and saltwater meeting, but certainly on the greater continent of China you do. And it would be easy enough to take this energy and pipe it into Hong Kong. This is a new investment area that I think many of you should be looking into. So let's talk a little bit about some of the jobs of the future. There are going to be so many new jobs. I've identified over 150 brand new jobs that people love. But where I'd like to focus is on jobs that would impact the C-suite, because that's where most of you are. And I want to give you an idea of what the executive suite of tomorrow might look like. So first, let's talk about human resources, HR. I think in the very near future, and it may already be starting to happen in some progressive companies, we're going to see HR mean the head of human and robot orchestration. And when I use the term robot, I'm not talking just about physical robots, I'm talking about software robots, AI as well. And the head of HR will be decision makers that decide where do we use physical human, where do we use AI software, where do we use a robot, and how do we get them to best work together as co-collaborators in a team. Another important aspect of this new style of HR is being able to take all of this real-time data that is being fed in and being able to change your business case or your marketing methodology or your messages in real time based on the information that your machine colleagues are feeding into you. HR is also increasingly going to have a role in the wellness of staff and also the wellness of customers, particularly during these days of the pandemic. Another new job of the future is the Chief Ethics Officer. I've been calling it the other CEO, and it's been picked up in a number of magazines and other places as well. So if you remember, with techniques like deep learning and machine learning, the way that AI learns is that it's literally sucking in massive databases, terabytes of data, so massive that a human or a team of humans couldn't even read it in their entire lifetime. And if your company is using that data to make decisions, then you need to be aware that those databases may contain inherent biases that may not reflect the values of your company or even of your executive suite. And one of the things that's going to be very important is having a human in the loop, a team of humans. Reinforcement learning is one of the techniques that will be required, but bias is a really big issue. And there are other aspects of this as well. So for example, think about driverless cars. And I think this is something you can all relate to. What if you have driverless cars that are going down the road and there's an unavoidable accident? How are they going to make that decision about who to kill or harm? What if different manufacturers have different rules? These are things that we haven't quite caught up with. One of the things to bear in mind is that around the world, I don't care what kind of society you're in, laws are based on humans making decisions, not machine decisions. And again, regulation hasn't caught up with what's happening in the real world. And there have been a lot of examples already where machines have made wrong decisions or have expressed bias. And it's something that we really need to be aware of. And I think that this is going to be an extremely important position for organizations to have on their executive team as we move into the future. Another area that I am super passionate about is privacy. And I think one of the new jobs of the future is going to be a party. And it impacts us as individuals, but also as companies too. So one of the things that you may be aware of is legislation called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which came out of the EU. Raise your hand if you've heard of GDPR. Yeah, I think everybody has. So one of the things you need to be aware of is what kind of information is your company collecting about people or businesses, and do you really need to collect it, and how are you securing it, and how are you sharing that data? Should you be sharing that data at all? I'll tell you the number of times that I have seen companies send plain text emails or maybe PDF attachments that have hugely sensitive information such as people's birthdays, social security numbers, or the equivalent of whatever your government identification is in wherever part of the world. And you know what? That is not secure. It's secure, it's configured correctly by the end client on every single one of their devices, and every hop along the way uses the correct security protocols, but it's only secure while it's in transit, not at rest. If you are sending any sensitive information by email, stop now. I'm giving you homework. I want you to take a look right now, when you go back to your offices, at what kind of information your company sends out by email to its clients, and check and see whether you are sending any sensitive information that can lead to identity theft or theft of confidential data pertaining to your company's activities. Because if you're sending it by plain text email, you're putting your company in huge jeopardy. So now let's go to the future of humanity. This is where we start to get really fun and wacky. Will we as humans actually take technology into our bodies? Will we become cyborgs? Well, one of the very first areas that I think we're going to start to see technology starting to merge with our bodies is smart contacts. And this has been talked about, for at least 7 years I've been tracking this. But it's been delayed, a little bit out, a little bit out, a little bit out. I think it's finally now coming to market. So imagine that you've got every function that you have on your smartphone plus biotech in smart contact lenses bodies. That's going to start to give you superhuman powers. So there was a company that was in stealth mode for a long time. They came out towards the end of last year called Mojo Vision, and they've got something called Mojo Lens. And it literally uses eye tracking to allow you to literally have things beamed right into your retina instead of looking at a screen. You're actually seeing images. It's like augmented reality on steroids. But there are also a range of well-known pharmaceutical companies, research labs, and brand new startups on the biotech end of this, which is where it gets even super exciting, because these companies are designing products that will, for instance, allow the release of antihistamines directly through the contact lenses into your eyes. Or let's say you have suffered a chemical burn to your eyes, these contact lenses could literally produce a hydrogel and help heal the burn to your eyes. There are other companies that are looking at dispensing drugs directly through your contact lens into your eyes. And still other researchers and companies that are looking at using the information in your tear ducts to determine your health, in particular, interocular pressure to detect the onset of glaucoma so that you can do something about it before it happens. But that's just the first step. And smart contacts are okay because you can take them in and out. You're not stuck with them. If you're not, you can take it out. But what if you go to the next step? Well, the future of humanity is going to involve some things that are really interesting and exciting, also maybe a little bit scary. First of all, stem cell technology is really interesting because what we're doing is using from our own bodies, the stuff that a lot of people want to get rid of, actually maybe the building blocks that allow us to rebuild an organ that's failing out of our own body. So imagine in 10 years' time, if you need a heart transplant and literally you're using your own stem cells to grow a new organ, no more taking anti-rejection drugs for the rest of your life. You're going to have a heart that literally fits exactly into your body. There are experiments in Israel where they've already grown miniature human hearts. There's still a lot of work to do. It's at least 10 years out. Genetic engineering is another area that is super exciting. There are researchers that believe that within the next 10 years or so, maybe 20 years, we'll find the switch that controls aging. Can you imagine what it would be like if you were to live for 400 years or 800 years? Imagine working in the same job for 400 years. How many of you want to work for 400 years? Anyone? Imagine being married to the same person for 800 years. Now look, you may love the person, but in 800 years, your interests are bound to diverge. What will be the impact on population if people have extended lives and we continue to have babies? If you think we've got population problems now, imagine people live these extended lives. And it gets even crazier than that. What if we could actually, aging, the Salk Institute is working on that and has already done that with a live mouse with a disease called progeria and made this live mouse younger again. But then, even more exciting, we've got nanotechnology. And this is just an illustration. There are lots of research labs and companies around the world working on nanobots. These are teeny, microscopic robots. It's another aspect of artificial intelligence. This one is an illustration, but there's a nanobot that is being tested by the Nanotech Institute of China and Arizona State University that literally is able to detect certain types of tumors by looking at the protein that codes them and unfurl and inject a blood clotting drug exactly where a cancer is growing. So no more just getting chemotherapy and hoping for the best. It's targeted precision medicine. And there are a lot of companies looking at nanotech and nanobots. And in fact, as we go further into the future, it's not going to be just disease prevention or disease fixing diseases. It's going to be disease. These things are going to be swimming around in our bodies and potentially acting as, super duper souped up white blood cells and protecting us from things that could eventually harm us. But what if something goes wrong? Well, if it does, you're going to need someone like a nanomedic to come and help you fix it. And then we get even further, and that is taking chips into our brains. Oh my gosh. Now, a lot of the research started with memory. So for people with Alzheimer's and dementia, if you can imagine having a chip in your brain that helps you keep your memories, that's wonderful. Or you've had a spinal cord injury and suddenly you're able to walk again, so your limbs, that's wonderful, that's a medical use. But what if you take it a step further where people like Elon Musk and Neuralink want to be able to have a symbiosis between AI and a human? And sometimes the human's in control, and sometimes it's the AI chip that's in control. Well, who's responsible? Is it you or the chip? And some of the things that are being looked at include controlling your emotions and also giving you super hearing. A whole lot of research is going into this area. There's one last thing that I'd like to talk about before we go into the Q&A thing. And this is another huge area that is so exciting to me, and that is outer space. The final frontier. Couldn't help but take that from the start back, but it's happening in our lifetimes because of private industry's development of reusable rockets. That is making space travel a reality, and we are on the cusp of becoming a multi-planetary civilization. And what's really wonderful is that recently NASA has discovered that there actually is quite a bit of water on Mars. They've discovered what looks like running water from time to time at the Hale crater back in December of 2019. That's on Mars. And they've also discovered reservoirs of water in one of the polar regions as well. And just recently, NASA has discovered water on the summit portions of they weren't expecting. They don't know if it's native to the moon, if it was deposited by meteorites, or maybe even energetic particles from the sun. But having two planetary bodies just in our solar system bodes really well for us being able to go out into space and having an essential ingredient, which is water. So our next human habitats may look something like this, and they'll probably be 3D printed before we even go there by robots using native materials. And I'll add that this idea of becoming a multi-planetary civilization, not just in our solar system, is being confirmed by astronomers and NASA. NASA has identified over 4,000 exoplanets, and the estimates are that there are over 300 million planets just in our one galaxy that could support human type of life, and that's just our galaxy. So one of the very next things that we might be seeing, and it's already starting to happen, is space travel. Space is the next big, big industry. So I'd like to thank you for having listened, and now we're going to go to Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and continue to go through.